Louis XVI should not have died. How the guillotine ruined the French Revolution. The stone walls of the Temple Tower do not care for the titles of men. In the winter of 1792, the dampness of Paris seeped into the very marrow of the man once known as the most powerful monarch in Christendom. He was no longer Louis XVI by the grace of God, King of France and Navarre. To the guards who watched him with cold, unforgiving eyes, he was merely Louis Capet, a prisoner, a citizen, and a ghost of an era the world was trying to bury alive. He sat by a small, flickering fire, the light dancing across the pages of a book, trying to find solace in the words of ancient philosophers while outside. The city he once ruled screamed for his blood. Louis believed, with a tragic and quiet sincerity, that the law would be his shield. He believed that the very constitution he had sworn to uphold, even as it stripped him of his absolute power, would protect him from the madness of the mob. But what Louis XVI failed to understand was that in the heart of a revolution, the law is not a shield, it is a weapon, and its edge was sharpening with every passing hour. The fall from the golden halls of Versailles to the freezing shadows of a medieval prison was not just a change in geography, it was a total collapse of reality. Only a few years prior, Louis had been the center of the universe, a man whose every movement was chronicled as if it were a celestial event. But by late 1792, the sun had set on the House of Bourbon. The French Revolution, which had begun with a desperate cry for bread and representation, had mutated into something far more volatile. It was no longer about reform, it was about the total erasure of the past. To the radicals gathered in the National Convention, Louis was not a man to be judged, but a symbol to be destroyed. Yet, for a brief, flickering moment, it seemed possible that he might survive. There were many in the government, the Girondins, who feared that killing the king would ignite a fire that would consume France entirely. They sought a middle ground, a way to keep the king alive as a hostage to history. But then, a secret hidden behind a wall in the Tuileries Palace changed everything. The discovery of the armoire de fer, the iron chest, was the moment the trap snapped shut. It was a secret safe, expertly concealed within the walls of the king's former residence, and its contents provided the radicals with exactly what they needed, a narrative of betrayal. Inside were hundreds of documents, private correspondences that whispered of secret negotiations with foreign powers and clandestine plans to subvert the revolution. To a modern historian, these papers show a man caught in an impossible vice, trying to navigate a path between his duty to his ancestors and the terrifying demands of a new world. But to the Jacobins, led by the cold, incorruptible Maximilien Robespierre, these papers were not evidence of a man's struggle, they were a manual for treason. The revelation of the iron chest turned a complex political debate into a mandatory death sentence. It allowed the radicals to claim that Louis had never truly accepted the revolution, that his every smile was a mask for a dagger. As the news of the secret safe spread through the mud-clogged streets of Paris, the atmosphere shifted from tension to a predatory hunger. The king, who had once been loved as a father of the people, was now portrayed as a predatory serpent, a Louis the Last who had conspired with the Austrians and the Prussians to bathe Paris in the blood of its own citizens. Inside the Temple Tower, Louis heard the distant roar of the crowds. He knew the sounds of Paris well, but the tone had changed. It was no longer the sound of a petition. It was the sound of a verdict. Yet even as his world narrowed to the dimensions of a prison cell, Louis maintained a strange, almost eerie composure. He spent his days teaching his son, the young Dauphin, Latin and history, as if he were preparing the boy for a throne that no longer existed. He was a man who had always been indecisive in power, but in his downfall he found a terrifyingly calm resolve. He was convinced that if he could only speak to the people, if he could only explain the complexities of his position, the good Frenchman would understand. He did not realize that the good Frenchman he remembered had been replaced by a collective psychological storm that no longer spoke the language of reason. The National Convention became the stage for one of the most significant dramas in human history. The trial of Louis XVI was not just a legal proceeding, it was an existential crisis for the young republic. If the king was guilty of treason, then the revolution was justified. But if the king was innocent, then the republic was a crime. Robespierre, with his high-pitched voice and terrifyingly logical mind, laid out the stakes with brutal clarity. He argued that Louis did not need a trial. Louis must die, Robespierre declared to the Assembly, because the country must live. To the radicals, the king's existence was a living denial of the people's sovereignty. Every breath he took was an insult to the Republic. The Jacobins didn't want justice. They wanted a ritual sacrifice that would bind the nation together in a pact of blood. They knew that once the king's head fell, there would be no turning back. France would be committed to the revolution forever, for no monarchy in Europe would ever forgive the regicide. The atmosphere in Paris during those months was suffocating. The city was a powder keg of hunger, paranoia, and religious zealotry for the new secular order. The sans-culottes, the working-class radicals of the city, patrolled the streets with pikes, their eyes searching for any sign of aristocracy or counter-revolution. To speak a word in favor of the king was to invite a trip to the lantern, the streetlights from which suspected traitors were often hanged. The very air seemed to vibrate with the mechanical rhythm of the new age. And in the center of it all sat the Temple Tower, a dark, silent monolith holding the man who had become the ultimate scapegoat for centuries of systemic failure. Louis was being blamed not just for his own mistakes, but for the famines of his grandfather's reign, for the debts of the 7 Years' War, and for the very concept of divine right that had sustained his family for 1,000 years. As the trial began, Louis was brought before the convention. He was dressed simply, his beard slightly overgrown, his eyes tired but clear. When he was addressed as Louis Capet, he responded with a quiet dignity that unsettled his accusers. "I do not recognize that name," he said, reminding them that his ancestors had given France its shape and its soul. But the convention was not interested in his soul. They read out the charges, many of them based on the documents found in the iron chest. They accused him of shedding the blood of Frenchmen on the 10th of August, the day the Tuileries was stormed. It was a cruel irony. The man who had famously refused to allow his Swiss guards to fire on the mob until it was too late was now being charged with the very massacre he had tried to prevent. The evidence was being massaged, manipulated, and in some cases outright fabricated to ensure that the outcome was never in doubt. The secret tragedy of Louis XVI was that he was a man of the Enlightenment who found himself the victim of its most violent excesses. He had supported the American Revolution, sending French gold and blood to help a new republic across the sea, never imagining that the same ideals of liberty and equality would return to haunt his own doorstep. He had abolished torture in French prisons and tried to tax the nobility, only to be blocked by the very institutions that should have supported him. He was a reformer at heart, but he lacked the ruthlessness required to survive a revolution. He was a king who wanted to be loved, and in the end, it was that desire for love that led him to the scaffold. He had refused to flee when he had the chance, and when he finally did try to escape in the famous flight to Varennes, his own indecision had betrayed him. Now, as the year 1792 bled into 1793, the trial reached its fever pitch. The defense lawyers, brave men who knew they were likely signing their own death warrants by standing beside the king, argued that the king was inviolable under the Constitution. They argued that he could not be tried for acts committed while he was the legal head of state. But the radicals had a different logic. They argued that the revolution was a state of nature, and in a state of nature, there are no constitutions, only the will of the people. And the will of the people, as channeled by the Jacobin clubs and the street orators, was demanding a head. The tension within the convention was not just between the king and his accusers, but between the different factions of the revolutionaries themselves. The Girondins knew that killing Louis would provoke an invasion by every monarch in Europe, turning France into a slaughterhouse. They proposed an appeal to the people, a national referendum to decide the king's fate. It was a desperate attempt to move the decision away from the heated atmosphere of Paris and into the more conservative provinces. But the Jacobins saw this for what it was, a stalling tactic. They used the threat of the Paris mob to intimidate the deputies. The galleries of the convention were filled with tricoteuses, women who sat knitting while they screamed insults at any deputy who spoke of mercy. The pressure was psychological, physical, and absolute. The turning point was not a grand speech or a piece of evidence, but a betrayal that cut Louis to the quick. His own cousin, Philippe Égalité, the Duke of Orléans, had reinvented himself as a radical revolutionary. Philippe sat among the deputies, and when the time came to vote on the king's fate, he would have to choose between his family's blood and his own political survival. This betrayal would become the symbol of the revolution's cruelty, a world where even the closest bonds of kinship were sacrificed on the altar of virtue. As the final days of the trial approached, the city of Paris held its breath. The shops were closed, the cannons were loaded, and the shadow of the guillotine began to stretch across the Place de la Révolution. Louis, in his cell, began to prepare his will. It was not a document of a king, but the testament of a father and a Christian, a document that would eventually move even his enemies to tears with its humility and its forgiveness. But forgiveness was a luxury the Republic could not yet afford. The machinery of the state was in motion, and it would not stop until it had performed the ultimate act of regicide, an act that would shatter the moral foundation of the revolution and begin the long, dark descent into the Great Terror. The winter of 1793 arrived with a cruelty that seemed tailored for the ending of an era. Inside the Temple Tower, the air was a thick, frozen weight that smelled of wood smoke and damp stone. Louis Capet, once Louis XVI, moved with a slowness that was not born of age, but of the crushing realization that the world outside his window had become unrecognizable. The obstacles placed before him were no longer political, they were visceral. Every day, the guards found new ways to strip away the remaining fragments of his humanity. They blew tobacco smoke into his face as he walked to the small garden for exercise. They scrawled obscenities on the walls of the stairwells, depictions of the guillotine and insults directed at his wife Marie Antoinette. They forbade him from using the title of king, and even worse, they began to restrict the time he could spend with his family. The walls were not just keeping him in. They were slowly pressing the life out of him before the blade even had a chance to fall. The trial at the National Convention had become a labyrinth with no exit. Louis's defense team, led by the aged and courageous Malesherbes, worked by candlelight in a race against a clock that was already broken. They faced an impossible task. How do you defend a man against the charge of being a king in a world that has decided kingship itself is a crime? The iron chest, the armoire de fer, continued to poison every argument they made. Even when the defense proved that many of the documents were taken out of context or were simply routine diplomatic correspondence, the Jacobin press screamed of the king's hidden treachery. The public didn't want facts, they wanted a catharsis. The breadlines were longer than ever, the currency was collapsing, and the war on the borders was going poorly. The people needed a reason for their suffering, and the radicals gave them one. The man in the Temple Tower was a saboteur, a secret ally of the Austrians, a monster who had plotted to starve Paris. In the quiet hours of the night, when the taunts of the guards finally faded into the silence of the prison, Louis sat alone with his thoughts. It is in these moments that we see the man behind the crown. He was a man of deep, almost agonizingly quiet faith. He looked at his hands and remembered the day of his coronation, when those hands had been anointed with holy oil. He truly believed that his power had been a burden placed upon him by God, a duty to protect a people who were now demanding his head. He didn't feel anger so much as a profound soul-shattering confusion. He had tried to be the boulanger, the baker who would bring bread to his people. He had signed the laws that gave rights to Protestants and Jews. He had tried to listen. But the revolution was a tide, and he was a man standing on a sandbar, watching the water rise above his knees, then his waist, then his chest. He wrote his will during these nights, a document that is perhaps the most human piece of writing to emerge from the entire revolution. In it he asked his son to never seek vengeance for his death. He forgave those who were about to kill him. It was the internal monologue of a man who had already accepted his fate, but was still desperately trying to find a moral anchor in a storm of nihilism. But while Louis found peace, the city outside was descending into a fever. The Girondins, the moderate faction of the convention, were terrified. They knew that if they voted to execute the king, they would be handing total power to the Jacobins and the Paris mob. They tried every legal maneuver possible to delay the inevitable. They proposed a national referendum, hoping that the voices of the farmers and the villagers in the provinces would drown out the bloodlust of the Parisian streets. But the Jacobins turned the trial into a test of revolutionary purity. If you voted for the referendum, you were a royalist. If you voted for a delay, you were a traitor. The galleries of the convention were packed with the most radical elements of the city, who hissed and threatened any deputy who dared to speak of mercy. The trial was no longer about Louis. It was about who would control the future of France. The turning point came on January 15, 1793. The convention was called to vote on 3 questions: the guilt of the king, whether there should be an appeal to the people, and finally the punishment. The first question was a formality. Hardly anyone dared to vote not guilty in the face of the iron chest evidence. But the second question, the appeal to the people, was the last hope for the monarchy. When the votes were counted, the appeal was rejected. The fate of Louis was now entirely in the hands of the 749 deputies in that room. The air in the hall was electric, suffocating. Men who had been friends for decades looked at each other with suspicion and fear. They knew that their names would be recorded in history for this vote, and more importantly, they knew that the mob outside was checking the lists. Then came the appel nominal, the roll call vote for the sentence. Each deputy had to walk up to the rostrum and announce his vote and his reasons out loud in front of everyone. This was a masterstroke of intimidation by the Jacobins. It took nearly 24 hours. One by one, men climbed the steps. Some spoke with bravado, shouting "death" to the cheers of the gallery. Others spoke with trembling voices, trying to justify a vote for detention or banishment. The tension grew as the count remained agonizingly close. It seemed as though the moderates might actually hold the line. It seemed as though the Republic might choose to be a nation of laws rather than a nation of executioners. But then a figure stepped forward that caused a hush to fall over the entire assembly. It was Louis-Philippe Joseph, the Duke of Orléans. He was a prince of the blood, a cousin to the king. He had spent his life in the shadow of the throne, harboring a deep resentment for Louis and Marie Antoinette. He had rebranded himself as Philippe Égalité, the ultimate citizen patriot. When he reached the rostrum, the room was so silent you could hear the flickering of the candles. Everyone expected him to abstain, or perhaps to vote for exile. Surely a man could not vote for the death of his own cousin, his own flesh and blood. Philippe Égalité looked out at the assembly, his face a mask of cold political ambition. In a firm, clear voice, he said, "Solely occupied by my duty, I vote for death." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. It was the ultimate betrayal. Even the most hardened Jacobins were shocked by the coldness of the act. For Louis, when he later heard the news in his cell, this was the moment the world truly ended. It wasn't just that his cousin had voted for his death, it was that the act signaled the total collapse of the moral order. If a prince could kill a king, if a cousin could kill a cousin for the sake of political favor, then there were no longer any rules. The Republic had not just condemned a man, it had committed a kind of spiritual suicide. The vote for death passed by the narrowest of margins. Depending on how the secondary votes were counted, it was a difference of only a few dozen men. The news was brought to Louis on the evening of January 20th. He was told he had 24 hours to live. He received the news with a calm that stunned the officials sent to inform him. He had only 2 requests: 3 days to prepare himself to meet God, and a final meeting with his family. The 3 days were denied, the revolution was in a hurry, but the meeting with his family was granted. That final meeting in the dining room of the Temple Tower was a scene of such raw, unshielded grief that even the guards, men who had spent months mocking the king, had to turn their heads away. For 2 hours, Louis held his wife and children. He spoke to his son, the young boy who was now, in the eyes of the royalists, Louis XVII. He made the boy swear once again never to seek revenge. He whispered to Marie Antoinette, trying to give her a strength he wasn't sure he possessed himself. When he finally tore himself away, he promised to see them again the next morning. But he knew he couldn't. He knew that another such meeting would break him, and he needed to remain a king for the final walk. As the night of January 20th deepened, the city of Paris fell into an eerie, unnatural silence. The government had ordered that no one be allowed on the streets except for the National Guard. Cannon were placed at every major intersection. The sheer scale of the military presence showed how much the Republic feared the man they were about to kill. They weren't just killing a man, they were trying to kill 1,000 years of history, and they were terrified that the history might strike back. Louis spent his final hours in prayer with an Irish priest, Father Edgeworth. He slept for a few hours, a deep and peaceful sleep that seemed impossible given the circumstances. When he woke, the mist was thick over the Seine, and the sound of muffled drums began to roll through the streets. The machine was ready. The national razor was waiting in the Place de la Révolution. And as the carriage arrived to take him to the scaffold, Louis XVI stepped out of his cell, not as a broken prisoner, but as a man who understood that his death would be the final, most powerful act of his reign. He was about to show the world that while the revolution could take his life, it could never take his dignity. The morning of January 21st, 1793, did not break with a sunrise, but with a thick, suffocating shroud of grey mist that clung to the rooftops of Paris like a funeral pall. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the heavy iron keys turned in the lock of Louis Capet's cell for the last time. He had spent his final night in a calm that bordered on the supernatural, a peace that his jailers found more unnerving than any display of rage or terror. He had received the final sacrament from Father Edgeworth, the Irish priest who had risked his life to stand by a condemned king. Louis wore a simple white shirt and a brown coat, his hair shorn at the neck by his own hand to save the executioner the trouble. As he stepped out of the temple tower, the air was so cold it felt like a physical blow, but the man who had once been the most powerful monarch in the world did not flinch. He was no longer a king struggling with a crown he never wanted. He was a man who had finally found the one thing the revolution could not touch, his own soul. The journey to the Place de la Révolution took nearly 2 hours, a slow, agonizing procession through a city that had been turned into a military camp. Over 80,000 armed men lined the route. Cannons were placed at every bridge and intersection, their muzzles pointed not at an invading army, but at the citizens of Paris themselves. The revolutionary government was terrified that even now, at the 11th hour, a spark of royalist sentiment might ignite the crowd. They had forbidden any shouting, any cheering, and any movement. The only sound was the rhythmic, hypnotic beat of the drums, the muffled drums of the National Guard, and the clatter of the horses' hooves on the frozen cobblestones. Inside the carriage, Louis remained silent, his eyes fixed on the pages of a prayer book. He did not look out the window at the streets he had once walked as a god. He knew that the Paris of his ancestors was gone, replaced by a machine of ideological fury that demanded a sacrifice he was now ready to provide. When the carriage finally groaned to a halt at the edge of the square, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the skeletal silhouette of the guillotine. It stood in the center of the Place de la Révolution, on the very spot where a statue of Louis's grandfather, Louis XV, had once looked out over a prosperous kingdom. Now that statue was a pile of rubble, and in its place sat the national razor, its heavy blade glinting with a dull, leaden light. The square was a sea of bayonets and red liberty caps. As Louis stepped out of the carriage, he looked up at the scaffold. For a moment, his natural human instinct flared, a brief, sharp hesitation as he looked at the instrument of his death. But then he straightened his back. He refused to let the guards assist him as he climbed the steep wooden steps. Each creak of the timber was a second of history slipping away. At the top of the platform, the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, stepped forward with a coil of rope. This was the moment of the greatest tension. Louis, the descendant of St. Louis and the Sun King, recoiled at the thought of having his hands bound like a common thief. "Do what you will," he told Sanson, his voice firm, "but you shall never bind me." It was Father Edgeworth who leaned in and whispered the final words of comfort, reminding the king that even Christ had allowed his hands to be bound. With a sigh of resignation, Louis offered his wrists. His hair was cut further, the locks falling onto the wooden planks. He then did something that no one expected. He walked to the very edge of the scaffold, his bound hands gesturing for the drummers to stop. For a few miraculous seconds, the drums fell silent. The silence was so absolute that the entire square seemed to hold its breath. In a voice that was clear, powerful, and carried across the mud and the steel, Louis spoke his final words to the people of France. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge," he cried. "I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are now going to shed may never be visited on France." He was about to say more, perhaps to speak of the Iron Chest or the betrayals of his ministers, but the radical commander Antoine-Joseph Santerre, fearing the king's words might sway the mob, screamed the order, "Tambours!" The drums erupted in a thunderous roar, drowning out the king's voice forever. The revolution would not allow him the dignity of a final defense. It was the ultimate silencing of the past. Sanson and his assistants strapped the man who had been Louis XVI to the tilted board. His neck was placed into the lunette. For one heartbeat, the world was suspended in a vacuum of anticipation. Then the rope was pulled. The heavy steel blade, weighted with lead, slid down its tracks with a hiss. The sound was not a scream, but a dull, wet thud. When the head of Louis Capet was lifted from the basket and shown to the crowd, a strange thing happened. There was no immediate roar of joy. There was a long, hollow silence, as if the thousands of people gathered there had suddenly realized the gravity of what they had done. They had killed the father of the people. They had severed the head of the state. It was only after several seconds that the cries of "Vive la République" began to ripple through the square. But even then there was a frantic, desperate quality to the cheering. It was the sound of a people trying to convince themselves that they were free, while the blood of their history pooled beneath the scaffold. The death of Louis XVI was the point of no return. The mistake of the execution was not that it killed a man, but that it murdered the possibility of a moderate legal republic. By choosing blood over the constitutional process, the revolutionaries had validated the very tyranny they claimed to fight. The Iron Chest, which had been used as a tool of condemnation, was now forgotten, replaced by a much darker and more expansive list of suspects. Within months, the Great Terror would begin. The guillotine, having tasted royal blood, would soon develop an insatiable hunger for the blood of the revolutionaries themselves. The consequences were swift and devastating. The Girondins, who had tried to save the king's life through a referendum, were the next to find themselves on the tumbrils, accused of being royalist sympathizers. Philippe Égalité, the cousin who had cast the deciding vote for Louis's death in an act of ultimate political cowardice, did not find the safety he craved. Less than a year later, he too was led to the same scaffold, his patriotic rebranding failing to protect him from the paranoia of Robespierre. As he climbed the steps, he must have looked at the same grey sky Louis had seen, realizing too late that in a revolution there is no such thing as a safe betrayal. Marie Antoinette followed her husband in October of the same year, her beauty gone, her hair turned white by grief, but her dignity as a Habsburg princess intact until the end. The young Dauphin, the boy Louis had spent his final days teaching in the Temple Tower, disappeared into the dark bowels of the prison, dying alone and forgotten, a victim of a republic of virtue that had no room for children of the past. The revolution, which had begun with the high ideals of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, had become a self-consuming machine. It had replaced a king with a blade and a god with a shadow. And what of the men who pulled the strings? Robespierre, the architect of the terror, the man who had argued that Louis must die so the country could live, eventually found himself lying on the same wooden board, his jaw shattered by a bullet, unable to speak a single word before the blade fell. The revolution had devoured its own children, just as it had devoured its father. The execution of Louis XVI didn't save the Republic. It doomed it to a decade of slaughter that would only end when a young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power, replacing the chaotic tyranny of the mob with the organized tyranny of an empire. Today, the Place de la Révolution is known as the Place de la Concorde, the Place of Harmony. It is a beautiful open square where tourists take photos and the sun reflects off the fountains. But beneath the pavement lies the memory of a January morning when a man was killed for the crime of being a symbol. The secret of the Iron Chest and the trial of Louis XVI remain as a warning to history. They remind us that when a nation abandons the law in favor of the will of the people, when it replaces justice with vengeance, and when it believes that blood can fertilize the soil of liberty, it does not create a new world. It simply builds a faster way to the scaffold. Louis XVI was not a perfect king, and he was certainly not a hero of the modern age. He was a man of his time, caught in the gears of a machine he didn't understand. But in his death, he revealed the fundamental truth of all such upheavals, that the guillotine never chooses its victims. It only waits for the next name on the list. The Republic thought it was killing a tyrant, but it was actually killing its own conscience. And as the blade fell on that cold January morning, the countdown to the revolution's inevitable suicide had already begun. The king was dead, but the terror was only just beginning to wake up.